Can you solve this equation, Jamal? If you do, I'll marry you. Professor Catherine Sterling's voice rang out, dripping with mockery, slicing through the air of the university gala. The crowd froze, eyes darting to the janitor standing at the back. Jamal Washington, a humble figure in worn clothes, was sweeping the floor, doing his job quietly as he always did. But today, he had caught the professor's eye. The guests around her laughed. A few glanced toward Jamal, amusement dancing in their eyes. No one expected him to be anything but the invisible man in the background. Catherine didn't even bother hiding her smirk. Bet you can't solve it, she continued, her tone playful yet sharp, like a blade veiled in silk. What do you say, Jamal? Show us how smart you really are. Or are you too busy with your cleaning? The laughter grew louder. Jamal's face remained impassive. His grip tightened on the broom, but his hands were steady, calm. His heart, though, it thudded like a drum in his chest. Not from fear, but from a sharp-cutting frustration. He had been dismissed. Not just by her, but by everyone who looked at him and saw only a janitor. He had lived with it, his whole life, always underestimated, always invisible. But there were things they didn't know, things they could never guess. Catherine raised an eyebrow, sensing the tension building in the room. "You're really not going to take me up on my challenge?" she teased. The crowd murmured in agreement, egging Jamal on, daring him to make a fool of himself. He stood still as stone, letting the moment stretch. A bead of sweat trickled down his neck, but he didn't wipe it away. Slowly, he set the broom aside and walked to the front of the room. No words. Just the soft rustle of his shoes against the polished floor. Jamal's gaze locked with Catherine's. She chuckled under her breath, clearly expecting him to back down. But Jamal didn't. His eyes were calm, almost unreadable. The chalkboard loomed before him, and without hesitation, he picked up a piece of chalk. The crowd watched, their laughter dying down. Was he serious? Was he really going to attempt this? "All right, Jamal," Catherine sneered. "Let's see what you've got." Jamal didn't respond. He simply stood there, the weight of the room pressing down on him. The equation on the board looked complex, complicated even to some of the brightest minds in the room. But Jamal, he had been solving problems like this for years, only they weren't the kind you saw on chalkboards. His world had always been more practical, more real, but the same principles applied. He began to write, the chalk scraping against the board. His movements were precise, measured. He worked quickly, as if the numbers were already dancing in his mind. He didn't glance at the crowd. He didn't need to. His focus was absolute. The crowd had quieted, unsure of what to think. At first, they were waiting for him to fail, waiting for the moment when he would make a fool of himself. But then, as Jamal's chalk moved, the room grew still. No one could look away. Jamal wrote the final step, turned to face Catherine, and placed the chalk down with a soft click. His work was flawless. Catherine's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. "Well," she said, voice tight, "let's see if that's really the right answer." The room waited, holding its breath. Catherine walked up, her heels clicking sharply. She looked at the equation, the numbers, and her face froze. Her smile vanished. Jamal stood tall behind her, silently observing. The tension in the room shifted, but no one dared to speak. Then Catherine cleared her throat, eyes flicking to the crowd. It's right." The crowd was silent. No laughter, no mocking, just the sound of air catching in throats. Jamal had done it, but instead of backing down, Catherine doubled down, a shaky laugh escaping her lips. "Well, I didn't think you'd actually pull it off, Jamal, but I guess we'll see if that was just luck." Her voice faltered slightly, trying to reclaim her composure. The guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, realizing that something had just happened that they didn't expect, something that was bigger than any joke. But Jamal didn't care about proving himself to them. He hadn't solved it for their approval. He turned and walked away, leaving the room in stunned silence. Would they ever truly see him for who he was? "You're really not going to take me up on my challenge?" Catherine's voice dripped with condescension as she looked at Jamal, still standing in front of the chalkboard. The crowd shifted uneasily, Watching the underdog, the janitor, holding his ground in the face of mockery, Jamal didn't flinch. He didn't move a muscle. His fingers tightened around the chalk, but his face was still, calm, almost unaffected. Catherine leaned in closer, eyes narrowing. "If you're too scared, just say so," she said, a smirk curling up at the corners of her lips. The crowd chuckled. It was a safe joke. At Jamal's expense, Jamal's eyes flicked briefly to the floor, his posture still steady. There was a subtle tension in the way his shoulders moved, as if every ounce of his being was pushing back against the world's expectations. His breath was measured, controlled. He wasn't scared. He was being forced into a corner again. But this time he wouldn't run. The silence stretched. The mocking laughter from the crowd echoed in his ears, but Jamal didn't even blink. He didn't care. The equation on the board was complicated. Even Catherine's sharp eyes were darting from one number to the next, but Jamal didn't need to worry about that. For years, he had been solving puzzles, ones that weren't nearly as clean and neat as the ones on the chalkboard. Problems of survival, of sacrifice, of holding his family together. This equation? It was nothing. Yet here he stood, about to take a test no one believed he could pass. The weight of judgment pressed down on him, but he refused to show it. Catherine looked at him, expecting him to back down. "You know, I think it's funny," she said with a soft laugh. "The people who think they can be anything other than what they are. Like you." The crowd chuckled again, louder this time, like a pack of wolves circling their prey. Jamal's fingers twitched slightly. His breath was still steady, his gaze unbroken. Catherine's voice turned sharper. "Well, show us what you've got, janitor. Or are you too busy cleaning up after all of us?" The laughter roared in his ears. But Jamal didn't hear it anymore. He had learned a long time ago to tune out the noise. Without a word, he moved toward the board. Every step was measured, controlled. He wasn't playing by her rules anymore. Catherine watched him, clearly amused. "I'm going to enjoy this." Jamal stood in front of the board, his body still. His mind, however, was already working. Each number, each symbol had a rhythm, a purpose. His fingers gripped the chalk, a small but powerful movement. The crowd's laughter faded into a low murmur. The sound of chalk on the board filled the room, a steady, almost hypnotic sound. Jamal didn't rush. He didn't need to. Catherine leaned forward, arms crossed, waiting for the mistake, the falter. But Jamal's movements were precise, flawless. With each stroke of chalk, the room quieted more and more. Catherine's smirk faded into a look of confusion. Was he actually doing it? She took a step closer, her eyes scanning the equation as if searching for a flaw, an opening. But Jamal didn't give her the satisfaction. He finished. And for the first time since he walked in, the room was silent. Jamal stepped back, his face betraying nothing. His hands were calm, his breathing steady. He looked at Catherine, then turned to the crowd. Catherine stood frozen for a second, as if the world had just tilted off its axis. She cleared her throat, trying to regain control. "Well, that's interesting," she muttered, her voice trembling ever so slightly. But the crowd? They weren't laughing anymore. They were watching, silent, unsure. The power had shifted. Jamal didn't smile. He didn't need to. His work spoke for itself, and for the first time, he felt something in the air shift. The laughter was gone. All that was left was the silence. And the weight of the crowd's shifting gaze. Is this a joke? Catherine's voice wavered as she stared at the equation Jamal had just completed. Her eyes flicked back to the board and then to Jamal, who stood silently behind her, his face unreadable. The crowd was still. No one dared to speak. Jamal's solution was flawless. But how? How could a janitor, someone who cleaned the very halls they walked on, be capable of something like this? Catherine's confidence cracked, but she quickly masked it with a cold, dismissive laugh. "Well, maybe you got lucky. Let's see if you can do it again." She erased part of his work, making sure to leave just enough of a mess to challenge him. Her tone was sharp, bordering on cruel. "Come on, prove it wasn't a fluke." Jamal didn't blink. His steady gaze remained on her, unwavering. He could feel the weight of the room, but it didn't faze him. He had been here before, dismissed, overlooked. But this was different. This time, he wouldn't back down. He stepped forward, chalk in hand. His movements were slow, deliberate. The room was holding its breath. The equation she had erased was complicated, but Jamal? He had already solved more difficult problems than this. His mind was like a machine, clicking through each calculation with ease. The crowd, once jeering, now shifted. The quiet murmurs filled the room. Some were still skeptical, but most were starting to wonder, could he really be as good as he seemed? Jamal wrote one number after another, each stroke more confident than the last. His silence spoke volumes. He didn't need to boast, didn't need to explain. His actions did all the talking. Catherine's face twisted into a frown. She was growing frustrated, her once mocking smile slowly replaced by something darker, doubt. "This is impossible," she muttered under her breath, though no one could hear her but herself. Jamal finished, and once again, his work was perfect. He stepped back, his expression calm as ever. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. The equation was done. The problem was solved. Catherine's eyes darted to the crowd, who now watched with bated breath. She turned back to the board, scanning it once more. Her fingers twitched, but she couldn't find the flaw she was searching for. She was defeated, and she knew it. Jamal stood there waiting for her response. But Catherine didn't know what to say. Her world, her reputation built on credentials and status, had just been shattered. And the quiet janitor, who she had so easily written off, had done it without breaking a sweat. The silence in the room grew heavy. Catherine looked at Jamal again, her mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. And then, in that silence, a thought flashed through her mind. Could this really be true? Had she misjudged him from the start? Jamal didn't wait for her to collect herself. His eyes, cold but calculating, met hers one last time. He didn't need her approval. He had already proven what he was capable of. As the room began to shift, Jamal turned away. The crowd, once laughing, now stared in awe. Catherine's hands were shaking. "No, this can't be happening," she whispered, but no one heard her. They were all too busy watching Jamal walk away, his head held high. And Catherine? She was left behind, standing in the silence of her own arrogance. "Are you sure you want to keep going?" Catherine's voice was barely a whisper now, the arrogance that had once dripped from every word slowly slipping away. She was still trying to hold on to her confidence, but it was slipping through her fingers like sand. The crowd was restless, shifting uncomfortably in their seats, unsure of what would come next. Jamal, standing in front of the chalkboard, didn't answer her. He didn't need to. His silence spoke louder than any words he could have said. Catherine took a deep breath, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the room. "Fine," she said louder this time, trying to regain some semblance of control. "Let's make this interesting. If you're so sure of yourself, let's see you solve this one." She scribbled a new equation on the board, far more complicated than the first. The numbers seemed to twist and turn in a way that even the most seasoned mathematicians would hesitate to approach. Catherine's eyes flicked to Jamal, daring him to try. The crowd stirred, whispers rippling through the room. "This one's too much for him," someone muttered. "He'll never solve that." The jeers returned, though this time they carried a different edge. They weren't just mocking Jamal anymore. They were starting to feel uncomfortable. Something had shifted in the room, but no one wanted to acknowledge it. Jamal stood still, his gaze fixed on the equation. His fingers tightened around the chalk, but his face remained calm, like a stone in the middle of a raging river. "I don't have all day." "Jamal," Catherine prodded, her voice still dripping with false sweetness. "Solve it or go back to sweeping floors." Jamal didn't respond. His silence only seemed to heighten the tension in the room. The crowd watched with bated breath, as if waiting for him to make a mistake. But Jamal wasn't going to make a mistake. He wasn't going to give them the satisfaction. He took a step toward the board and started writing. His movements were slow, deliberate, no rush. Each stroke of the chalk felt like a carefully measured decision. He didn't need to explain what he was doing. The numbers were dancing in his mind, clicking into place one by one. The crowd was watching, holding their collective breath. Catherine stood to the side, watching him work. She tried to maintain her composure, but her eyes were darting from the board to Jamal and back again. She kept telling herself that he couldn't possibly solve it. This equation was far beyond him. He was a janitor, for heaven's sake. He didn't belong in her world, but Jamal wasn't fazed. His hand moved with precision, solving the problem step by step. And as he worked, something started to happen. The murmurs in the room grew softer. The laughter faded. There was no more mocking, no more jeering. The silence grew deeper, heavier. Catherine's gaze shifted, a flicker of doubt crossing her face. She couldn't find a flaw. She couldn't spot a mistake. "This shouldn't be happening," Jamal finished. He stepped back from the board, his hand still hovering just above it. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look at Catherine. He didn't need to. His work was there, plain for everyone to see, perfect, simple, flawless. The room was utterly silent. The equation was solved. The problem had been cracked wide open. Catherine took a step forward, her eyes scanning the board, her fingers brushing against her lips in disbelief. She tried to find something, anything, that would prove him wrong. But she couldn't. This wasn't just a mistake. This wasn't just luck. Jamal had done it. Her heart raced, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Catherine was the one who was unsure. The crowd, once so certain that Jamal couldn't possibly match her intellect, now stood in stunned silence. They were watching something extraordinary happen, but none of them had the courage to say it out loud. Jamal didn't smile. He didn't need to. His eyes met Catherine's for just a moment, calm, unflinching, and then he turned, walking away from the board. Catherine stood there, frozen, her mouth slightly open, unable to process what had just happened. The crowd, once mocking, now stood in awe, their eyes glued to Jamal's every movement. The energy in the room had shifted completely. But the silence was broken by a voice, a respected academic from the back of the room, someone who had been watching quietly. "She's wrong, you know," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Everyone turned. The man stepped forward, eyes locked on Catherine, his voice steady and authoritative. "This isn't just about the equation. It's about the fact that we've all been blind to talent for far too long. Jamal's a genius, and you've been treating him like a joke." Jamal didn't look back. He didn't need to hear it. He had already proven his point. And Catherine, she stood there staring at the board, the weight of her arrogance finally starting to crush her. Catherine's eyes were wide, her breath shallow. She stared at the board, her mind racing as her fingers trembled against the chalk. The equation was still perfect. Jamal's solution was flawless, but somehow she couldn't bring herself to admit it. The room was dead silent now, the weight of Jamal's victory hanging in the air like a storm cloud. The smug, confident air she had walked in with was gone. It had shattered. All that was left was the cold reality of her failure. Jamal stood motionless, his back to the crowd. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't smiling. He didn't need to. His work spoke for itself. He had done it. He had beaten her, and the truth was undeniable. The whispers began to ripple through the room, soft at first, unsure. "How did he do that?" someone muttered. "He really solved it." Catherine's gaze flicked to the audience, but she couldn't make eye contact with anyone. The proud, accomplished professor was no longer the dominant force in the room. Jamal's calm confidence had stolen that from her. The tension was unbearable. Catherine tried to recover, tried to regain control, but her voice was thin, shaky. "This is impossible," she muttered half to herself. You couldn't," but there it was. The equation was solved, and the more she stared at it, the more the truth sank in. Jamal wasn't just a janitor. He was smarter, sharper, and more capable than anyone in that room had given him credit for. The crowd leaned forward, hanging on the edge of their seats, waiting for her to admit it. But Catherine didn't speak. She just stood there, her pride crumbling piece by piece. Jamal's eyes moved, but his expression didn't change. He turned slowly, his calm gaze finding Catherine's. He wasn't angry. He wasn't trying to rub it in, but there was something in the way he looked at her, something that told her he knew exactly what had just happened. He knew he had won. "Are you going to admit it, Catherine?" Jamal's voice was steady, but there was an edge to it. "Or do you need me to solve another one?" The words hung in the air like a challenge. Catherine didn't respond. She couldn't. The defeat was too complete, too overwhelming. Her eyes darted around the room, seeking validation, but there was none to be found. The crowd, which had once laughed at him, now watched in stunned silence, their admiration for Jamal growing with every passing second. Catherine took a step back, her heels clicking against the floor. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. She was trapped. Jamal had outsmarted her, and everyone in the room knew it. Jamal's eyes didn't leave hers. He wasn't about to say anything more. He didn't need to. With one final look, he turned and walked away. His steps were slow, deliberate. He had nothing left to prove. Behind him, the crowd whispered, exchanging glances, their awe and disbelief clear in every glance. Jamal had done it. And Catherine? She stood there, frozen, her reputation shattered, her arrogance destroyed. In that moment, it wasn't just her defeat. It was the collapse of everything she thought she knew about intellect, about talent, and the crushing realization that she had been wrong, so very wrong, about him. She stared at the chalkboard one last time, but this time she saw something else in the equation, something she hadn't noticed before. "I was once a student here, too." Jamal's voice cut through the silence, calm but heavy with truth. The words landed like a bomb in the room, shattering the tense stillness. Catherine blinked, her mind struggling to process what he had just said. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Jamal stood there facing the crowd, his gaze steady and unwavering, as if the weight of the moment didn't even faze him. The murmurs started again, low at first. Whispers swirled through the room. What did he say? He was a student here? They couldn't believe it. The janitor, the man they had all dismissed as nothing more than background noise, had been one of them. Catherine's pulse quickened. She had spent the entire evening trying to convince everyone, including herself, that Jamal was just a fluke. A lucky guess. But now, standing before her, was the undeniable truth. The man who had outclassed her in front of everyone wasn't just some janitor. He was a man who had walked the very halls she had, who had the same opportunities, and he had chosen to leave them behind. Jamal continued, his voice cutting through the growing noise. "I was a doctoral student at MIT, left it all behind to care for my mom. She needed me." His words were measured, each one heavy with a story that no one had bothered to hear. He wasn't here to brag. He wasn't here to seek revenge. He was simply telling the truth, something they had all overlooked. The room went completely still again. This time there was no laughter, no jeers, just the sound of people coming to grips with what had just been revealed. Catherine's face drained of color as the realization hit her. The arrogant professor who had once assumed that Jamal didn't belong in her world now stood face to face with someone who had more intellect in his little finger than she could ever hope to claim. Catherine opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Jamal turned slightly, his eyes moving from her to the crowd. "I didn't need to prove anything to you. I didn't want to be the one who was right. But now, you see me? You see the truth." There was no anger in his voice, no bitterness. He was simply stating facts. The crowd's eyes were wide, each person processing the weight of his words. Catherine had spent the entire evening treating Jamal like an outsider, but it was her own arrogance that had turned her into the true outsider in this story. Jamal's words hung in the air, and for the first time that evening, the balance of power shifted completely. Catherine's once perfect world, built on degrees and titles, had just been cracked wide open. She had underestimated the very man she had mocked, and now there was no escaping the truth. Jamal looked directly at Catherine, the quiet confidence in his eyes still there. "You thought I was nothing," he said softly, "but I was never the one who needed to prove something. You were." The silence was deafening. Catherine stood frozen, her world spinning. Jamal's words had not just pierced her pride, they had unraveled the very foundations of her beliefs. Her gaze flicked from Jamal to the crowd, but this time the admiration wasn't on her side. Jamal wasn't just a janitor. He was a man who had lived through far more than she could imagine, someone who had sacrificed for his family and still carried the brilliance she had dismissed. And now, he was the one with the power. Catherine's eyes lingered on him for a long, tense moment. She didn't know how to respond. How could she? She had nothing left to say. The truth was too much to swallow, and for the first time, it was her own ego that had been exposed for everyone to see. Without another word, Jamal turned and walked away, his steps deliberate and measured. The crowd parted, allowing him to pass through, no one daring to say a word. Catherine stayed rooted to the spot, a shadow of the proud professor she once was, left to face the unraveling of her own arrogance. And Jamal? He had already left the stage. But his victory? It had just begun. Jamal didn't look back as he walked away. The air was thick with tension, and the crowd was still buzzing with disbelief. But he wasn't interested in their whispers anymore. He had done what he came to do, and that was enough. Behind him, Catherine stood frozen, her face pale, her reputation in tatters. She had spent the entire evening trying to break him down, trying to prove that she was superior. But now it was her own arrogance that had been shattered. She had underestimated him, belittled him, and now there was no escaping the truth. Jamal's steps were slow but purposeful. The room had shifted. The people who once laughed at him now looked at him with a mix of awe and regret. Some were whispering his name, others in disbelief. The outsider had just become the center of attention, and Catherine? She was nothing but a spectator. The academic ally who had spoken up earlier watched Jamal's retreating figure, his eyes narrowing in thought. He stepped forward, positioning himself between Jamal and the still-shocked professor. "What's it going to take for you to admit it?" he said, his voice calm but firm. "You were wrong, Catherine." Catherine blinked, trying to process the words, but her mind was racing, her thoughts scrambled. Her reputation, her career, felt like it was slipping through her fingers. For so long she had been untouchable, but now, in the space of a few hours, everything she thought she knew had been dismantled by the janitor she had dismissed. The room grew quiet again, the murmurs soft but heavy with realization. Catherine opened her mouth, but no words came out. She wanted to defend herself. She wanted to explain away what had just happened. But she couldn't. The facts were undeniable. Jamal was brilliant, far more than she ever imagined, and she had treated him like a joke. As Jamal reached the door, he paused for a moment, glancing over his shoulder at the crowd that had once looked down on him. He didn't need their validation. But something inside him felt different now. This wasn't just a victory for him. It was a victory for anyone who had ever been overlooked, underestimated, for all the people who had been told they didn't belong. He turned back and spoke quietly, just loud enough for the crowd to hear. "You'll never truly know who someone is until you stop judging them based on what they look like, or what you think they're capable of." His words hung in the air, and for the first time that night, there was no arrogance, no challenge in his tone. Just truth. Catherine stood at the front of the room, staring at the spot where Jamal had been. The weight of his words settled in her chest, pressing down harder with each passing second. She had failed. Not just in the game, not just in front of her peers, but on a much deeper level. She had failed to see the worth in a person who was never supposed to have it. The silence lingered, and Jamal was gone. But as the doors closed behind him, something changed in the room. The crowd, still stunned, no longer saw the world through the lens of their own biases. And Catherine? She was left standing there, humbled, her pride and arrogance shattered. The rise of one person had made the fall of another inevitable. And Jamal? He had already risen above it all.